In the 1950s, American pride was at an all-time high. The country was coming off a win in World War II, the military was as strong as ever, and America was still a world power. These feelings were reflective of the growing interest in American football. Fans loved the hard hits and brutal tendencies of the game, and this malicious style of play intrigued viewers across the nation. However, as the years passed, the United States began to undergo certain changes, and the 1960s brought in an era of civil and political unrest. Strong reactions to the Vietnam War spearheaded a vibrant hippie movement that sent waves throughout the nation. This hippie culture endorsed peace, love, unity, and pacifism, which went against the hard hitting nature of football. Few places were hit harder by this culture change than Francis W. Parker, a school located in Lincoln Park in Chicago, Illinois. Parker was founded in 1901 on the ideas of progressive education. While Parker was always a liberal institution, these changes affected the school as well. The once popular football team was dying out, while the graceful sport of soccer became increasingly more popular.
Parker was good at football. I mean, football was, I think, in the American psyche a lot more in the early '60s than as the '70s arrived. Um, it was, sports wasn't as cool at that time.
Football during my era was a very positive experience. I mean, Parker was in the private school league at the time. We were not the largest school in the league.
So when I was in the lower grades, my favorite thing to do was to go to the Parker High School football games. And in the mid-'60s, we had some very good teams that, did very well in the independent league. And, it was a pretty normal football program.
Lower school and into my middle school years, and even into the first couple of years of high school, football was popular. People came out to the games. It was fun to watch. But by the end of my sophomore year was the last year that Parker had a high school football team.
Football at Parker in the early 60s was similar to a typical high school. Fans enjoyed watching the games, school spirit was high, and the team was successful. However, the 1960s were a decade of transformation for the world and the country, and Parker was certainly not immune.
Well, it was a pretty challenging time for Parker. There was some crazy things that were coming down. That was around the time of the Chicago 7 trials after the 1968 convention. There was just this climate of anarchy and wildness, and there was some pretty crazy things happened here in Parker.
I attended Parker during the 1960s and early 1970s, which were really part of the 1960s culturally. And Parker was and is a very liberal school, and so the 1960s hit Parker hard.
The year I graduated from Parker was the end of the countercultural revolutionary period. If you want to take one year which altered the United States and still alters it to this day, it was 1968. That was the year of Tet, the protests, Bobby Kennedy had been killed, Martin Luther King the country had been turned upside down.
A significant aspect of hippie lifestyle was influenced by drugs and the use of substances. Drug usage began to increase exponentially in the early 60s, and this experimentation turned into an epidemic, which reached its peak around the time Parker got rid of their team.
It was a pretty scary time. The prevalence of drugs throughout the culture and the city was a real problem.
Well, there was, I think most of the so-called drug interest was curiousness, not so much involvement, but on the football team they had some silly cheers that were about alcohol. We're all underage, but they were singing things like, what were the cheers? It was something about all the different kinds of alcohol. It's on the locker, a pint of vodka. It's on my chin, a taste of gin. It's on my nipple a bottle of Ripple, and they were they're singing this stuff, which these kids were kids, they didn't do that stuff, but it sounded cool. So yeah, there was I think things caught up with youth at that period a little too fast. There was a lot of misbehavior in the larger culture of the Beatles and the other crazy new bands were all advocating some pretty bad behavior, or seeming to advocate pretty bad behavior. So there was some of that being emulated by the students.
Large numbers of students, high school students in particular, but extending down into 7th and 8th grade, used drugs, and I think the administration didn't really know how to respond to it, and it didn't do anybody any good. And I saw really, really good kids who were smart and capable, and who had parents who loved them, and teachers who loved them, whose lives were destroyed by drugs.
The hippie culture developing at Parker had its effect on the football team, to the point where they struggled to find enough guys to play. While football was becoming less popular, the opposite was true for the soccer team. The wide-open style of play in soccer was more appealing to the students than the violent manner of football.
What I think makes soccer so popular, I think the speed and the grace of the game. Football is a lot of 3 yards crunch, hold back, okay, timeout, go back. Soccer is a little more fluid.
I think that there was something about at least the climate here in Chicago in the late 60s and early 70s, that somehow football was perhaps associated a bit more with a kind of aggressive, almost militaristic activity that was then associated with the war in Vietnam. And soccer had been a little bit more of a renegade activity. The soccer players tended to have their hair a little bit longer and be associated more with a worldwide sport than one that was only located dominantly as an American sport.
Soccer was way more fun. I mean, the people were just, it's a happier game. Football is just you're pretty much out to hurt somebody, and I mean, that's not the real purpose, but it's kind of the mentality.
I think soccer was cool. The guys who played soccer were cool. They were seen by the girls, and the football players were, considered a different sect, a different group. I was friends with a lot of guys who played football. I didn't think they were Neanderthals or anything like that, but whether they were perceived that way, it's open to interpretation.
Well, I played on a soccer team, and most of the kids were playing soccer by then. And so the sport, football, was discontinued for two reasons. It had become much less popular among students, and the second reason was that there were some parents who were doctors, and even then, decades before the concerns about concussions went national, doctors among the parents went to the school and said that they didn't think it was healthy.
During this time period, people were beginning to realize the dangers of football. Nowadays, we understand the effect concussions have on our brains, but this was not common knowledge at the time. The game was played with reckless abandon, which resulted in countless injuries.
There was never any conversation about the injuries other than what you might expect the injuries to be, which occasionally you broke a finger, or somebody broke a leg, or something like that, but that was really basically part of the sport.
My experience was one of a little bit of trepidation, and I'll tell you why. It was about a week and a half 2 weeks before I went into my first game, a kid died up at Senn High School, a football player. I think his name was Zamora. He suffered a fatal head injury. And I was kind of scared, you-know-what-less, because it was a rough sport. It wasn't like soccer.
You know, I think it was just obvious that with the lowered interest in football, that it was no longer sustainable, that we just had too few people and they were just getting injured. And it was a perfectly logical conclusion is don't let these kids hurt themselves. You know, and the coaches probably even had to look in the mirror and go, gee, what are we doing? We're just like bad generals marching people to their doom.
This guy deliberately came over and stepped on my ankle and cracked it, and broke it. I could hear it snap. There was a thrill to playing football, but the downside was this, and it affected my soccer. It affected me for the latter part of my life.
The game of football brought out the nasty side of the players. Injuries were caused by the ruthless tendencies of the game, and teams would put everything on the line to win. Unlike other schools, this savage play did not resonate with the values of Parker.
There's some people in life who are just nasty. They were nasty when they were 3, they'll be nasty when they're 33, they'll be nasty when they're 93.
I'm a peaceful guy. You know, we had the language of, you know, let's go get them, you know, and we're going to tear their heads off and stuff. But, you know, I think we were by and large a kinder, gentler football team than others. And some of the teams were evil. They'd have like salt shakers inside their jerseys and would be throwing salt in your eyes when you were coming across the line. And you know, there was some pretty bad behavior on the other side. Wanted to hurt us, and they did frequently.
Overall, the culture at Parker during this time period did not align with the principles of football. While football is still widely popular in American society today, there are growing concerns over the safety of the sport. An increasing number of parents are opting to have their children play soccer instead of football, showing that Parker was ahead of the curve 40 years ago.